A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
You know, looking back at the headlines from January and February of this year, there is this incredible, almost nauseating sense of cognitive dissonance. We were reading about high-level diplomatic summits in Muscat and talk of a new framework for regional stability, while just beneath the surface, the largest mobilization of kinetic force in a decade was quietly slotting into place. It is March 19th, 2026, and we are finally far enough removed from the initial strikes of early March to start peeling back the layers of what really happened. Today's prompt from Daniel is about this exact phenomenon, specifically looking at the military buildup leading to the Iran-United States conflict and evaluating whether those diplomatic negotiations were ever intended to succeed or if they were just a tactical facade.
Herman Poppleberry here, and Corn. This is the classic problem of signal versus noise in intelligence. When we look at the lead-up to the March operations, what we see isn't a failure of diplomacy in the traditional sense, but rather the highly successful use of diplomacy as an operational security tool. Most analysts were focused on the rhetoric coming out of the State Department, or the Iranian Foreign Ministry, but if you were looking at the dry, boring stuff, the logistics, the prepositioning of fuel, the movement of specialized medical units, the picture was completely different. We are talking about a triumph of strategic deception where the diplomatic mirage was maintained right up until the first tomahawks were in the air.
It feels like we were all watching a stage play while the stagehands were busy setting up a completely different set for the next act behind the curtain. Daniel wants us to dig into the sincerity of those negotiations. Was there ever a moment where a deal was actually on the table? Or was the decision to move to escalation dominance already made by the time the first diplomat sat down in Oman? To understand this, we have to define what we mean by the facade of diplomacy. It wasn't just a lack of progress, it was a deliberate tactical tool used for operational security, or OPSC.
In modern warfare, especially when dealing with a peer or near-peer adversary like Iran, you cannot simply steamroll into a conflict without telegraphing your moves unless you create a massive amount of informational noise. The shift we saw in early 2026 was a move away from traditional deterrence, which relies on being loud and scary, toward escalation dominance. Escalation dominance requires you to control every rung of the ladder, and the best way to ensure you own the top rung is to make sure the enemy doesn't even know you have started climbing.
So, let's get into the mechanics of that facade. We are talking about the Muscat talks. I remember the footage of the delegates walking along the beach, the joint statements about mutual respect and de-escalation frameworks. It all looked so sincere. But you are saying that while they were talking about frameworks, the Pentagon was finalizing flight paths.
The evidence from the declassified summaries and the leaked internal memos from the Israeli Ministry of Defense suggest that by mid-January, the window for a negotiated settlement had effectively closed. The diplomatic track was kept on life support specifically to fixate the adversary's attention. In military terms, this is about fixing the enemy's mental model. If the Iranian leadership believed that the United States was still invested in a diplomatic off-ramp, they were less likely to take the kind of preemptive defensive measures that would have made Operation Epic Fury much more costly. This is a concept called reflexive control. You provide the enemy with information that leads them to make a decision that favors your plan, while they think they are acting in their own best interest.
It is a dangerous game to play, using international conflict as a pressure valve for domestic political crises. And we have to talk about the internal situation in Israel during that same window. We have to remember that in early 2026, the Israeli coalition government was under immense domestic pressure. There were massive protests, questions about the budget, and a feeling that the regional threat from the northern border and the Iranian nuclear program was reaching a point of no return. Herman, do you think that internal volatility forced the hand of the planners?
The domestic pressure in Israel acted as a massive accelerant. There was a sense of a use it or lose it mentality regarding their strategic window. Prime Minister Netanyahu and his defense cabinet were looking at a domestic landscape where a long, drawn-out diplomatic stalemate was politically untenable. They needed a decisive shift in the security paradigm to maintain the coalition's mandate. We saw hints of this in episode 831 when we talked about the military buildup in late 2025. The shift in 2026 was that the Israeli intelligence community stopped trying to manage the threat and started preparing to dismantle it. The protests in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem weren't just about domestic policy. They were creating a sense of urgency that the government could only resolve through a major external security success.
It is a grim synergy when political survival and military strategy align like that. If the Israeli government felt that the diplomatic path was actually a trap designed to let Iran's proxies get the first move, then the facade wasn't just a US strategy, it was an Israeli necessity. They had to play along with the United States to maintain the alliance, but they were also preparing for reality where the talks were just a countdown to a massive multi-front attack on their own soil.
That is a key point. The trade-off of using diplomacy as a cover is that you burn your credibility for the future, but you gain immediate tactical surprise. For the Israeli coalition, the risk of a nuclear-capable Iran or a fully coordinated Hezbollah-Hamas Houthi strike was far greater than the risk of being seen as insincere in Muscat. If we look back at the patterns from episode 831, we can see the foundation being laid. But by February 2026, it wasn't just a buildup anymore, it was a countdown. The discrepancy between the public peace talk rhetoric in late January and the concurrent movement of naval assets into the Persian Gulf was staggering if you knew where to look.
Let's talk about those specific tells. Most people look at troop counts or carrier strike groups moving into the region, but you keep pointing toward the less flashy indicators. What were the specific tells in February that showed the facade of diplomacy was about to crumble?
The biggest tell, and one that Daniel pointed out in his notes, was the subtle shift in United States mission evacuations. It wasn't a loud public departure of ambassadors. Instead, it was the quiet, phased drawdown of non-essential personnel and their families from across the region under the guise of routine rotations or training exercises. When you see the logistics tail for civilian support starting to shrink while the fuel reserves in places like Al Udeid and Diego Garcia are hitting 95% capacity, you know the talking is just background noise.
It is like watching a house being packed up while the owners are still telling the neighbors they are planning a renovation. I remember the reports about the Iranian naval posture in the second week of February. There was this sudden quiet shift in the Strait of Hormuz. They weren't being loud or provocative with fast boats like they usually are. They were moving their more capable assets into hardened submarine pens and dispersing their land-based anti-ship missile batteries. That suggests they saw through the facade, right?
They saw the movement, but they miscalculated the timing. The Iranian high command seemed to believe that the United States wouldn't act until after the conclusion of the Muscat round of talks scheduled for late March. They thought they had another 6 weeks of maneuvering room. They were preparing for a conflict, but they were preparing on a timeline dictated by the diplomatic calendar. The brilliance, if you can call it that, of the U.S.-Israeli strategy was launching Operation Epic Fury, while the diplomatic teams were still technically at the table. It completely shattered the traditional escalation ladder.
That is the part that feels so different from previous conflicts. Usually you have the breakdown of talks, the angry press conferences, the United Nations Security Council emergency meetings, and then the missiles fly. Here, the missiles flew while the diplomats were still ordering coffee for the morning session. It feels like a fundamental shift in how modern warfare uses the information environment. Diplomacy isn't the alternative to war anymore. It is the vanguard of it.
That is exactly the shift we are seeing. In the 21st century, the goal is escalation dominance, and that requires a level of surprise that traditional diplomatic cycles don't allow for. If we look at the mechanics of Operation Roaring Lion, the Israeli component of the initial strikes, the level of cyber pre-positioning was staggering. We are talking about malware like the Scythe 7 variant that had been dormant in Iranian command and control systems for months, just waiting for the trigger. That kind of technical readiness doesn't happen during a sincere diplomatic negotiation. You don't spend 18 months building a backdoor into your neighbor's security system if you genuinely believe you can talk them into a peaceful resolution.
And the logistical spine of the operation was already fully formed by the time the first diplomat landed in Muscat in January. You mentioned the fuel reserves, but what about the ammunition supply points?
By mid-February, the United States had increased its regional military readiness indicators by 40%. We saw a massive influx of precision-guided munitions being moved from European depots to forward operating bases in the Middle East. This wasn't just a just-in-case movement, this was the final fill. When you see the specialized medical units, like the mobile surgical teams, being deployed to Cyprus and Jordan, you aren't looking at a diplomatic mission. You are looking at a combat-ready force waiting for the go signal.
It makes me wonder if anyone will ever trust a back-channel negotiation again. If the Muscat talks were purely a tactical deception, then the next time there is a real crisis, the diplomats are going to be talking to empty rooms because everyone will be too busy looking at satellite imagery of fuel depots. We have effectively burned the currency of international trust to gain a few days of operational surprise.
The cost is definitely high, but from the perspective of the military planners, the reduction in casualties for the attacking force was the priority. By masking the final stages of the buildup, they were able to achieve a level of air superiority within the first 6 hours that would have taken weeks in a more transparent escalation. The internal Israeli situation also can't be overstated. The coalition knew that a prolonged war would be a disaster for the economy, so they gambled everything on a lightning strike that would force a new reality on the ground before the international community could even react.
And it worked, at least in the short term. But the second-order effects are what worry me. When you look at the indicators we missed, or rather the ones that were hidden by the diplomatic noise, it changes how we have to analyze future conflicts. We talked in episode 881 about the situational report just days before the escalation. Even then, the public focus was on the possibility of a breakthrough in the talks. We were looking at the wrong map.
We were looking at the map the governments wanted us to see. If you want to see the real map, you have to look at the insurance premiums for maritime shipping in the Persian Gulf. In mid-February, those premiums spiked by nearly 300%. The underwriters at Lloyd's of London aren't interested in diplomatic rhetoric, they are interested in risk. They were seeing the movement of logistics ships and the requisitioning of civilian tankers for military use. That is a hard indicator that no amount of diplomatic theater can hide.
That is a great point. Money doesn't care about the facade. If the people who have to pay out when things go boom are suddenly raising their prices, you should probably listen to them more than the spokesperson at the State Department. I want to go back to the Israeli domestic situation for a second. There is this idea that the pre-war posture was driven by a sense of existential dread, but also by a very cold calculation about the regional balance of power. With Iran's proxies being so active in early 2026, did the Israeli government feel that the diplomatic path was actually a trap designed to let the proxies get the first move?
That was the prevailing view in the Israeli intelligence circles. They saw the diplomacy as a way for Iran to shield its proxies while they finalized the deployment of advanced drone swarms and precision-guided munitions in Lebanon and Syria. For Israel, the facade of diplomacy was a dual-layered problem. They had to play along with the United States to maintain the alliance, but they also had to prepare for a reality where the talks were just a countdown to a massive multi-front attack on their own soil.
So it was a race to see who could use the diplomacy more effectively as a cover. It reminds me of the build-up we discussed in episode 925, right after the first strikes. The speed of the transition from peace talks to total kinetic engagement was breathtaking. It suggests that the logistical spine of the operation was already fully formed by the time the first diplomat landed in Muscat in January.
It had to be. You don't move that much ordnance and that many specialized personnel on a whim. The lead time for a carrier strike group or the deployment of multiple F-35 squadrons to regional bases is measured in weeks and months, not days. The fact that they were ready to go the moment the order was given proves that the decision-making process was moving on a completely separate track from the public negotiations.
It is a sobering thought. We like to believe that our leaders are trying to find a way out of the abyss until the very last second. But the reality of modern high-stakes geopolitics is that once the gears of mobilization start grinding, They have a momentum that is almost impossible to stop. The diplomacy becomes a way to manage the fallout of the war you are already planning, rather than a way to avoid it.
And that is the practical takeaway for anyone trying to understand the next crisis. You have to ignore the podiums and look at the piers. Look at where the tankers are going. Look at the satellite imagery of the ammunition bunkers. If the bunkers are being emptied and the tankers are heading to forward deployed bases, the diplomatic talks are just a formality. In the lead up to Operation Epic Fury, we saw a 40% increase in regional military readiness indicators throughout February, all while the press was reporting on progress in the Muscat talks.
It is about looking for the discrepancies. If the words say de-escalation, but the actions say logistics, believe the logistics. Every time. I also think the role of cyber in this conflict was a huge indicator that we all missed. There were these weird outages in Iranian civilian infrastructure in late February. Most people thought it was just the usual state of things there. But in hindsight, those were likely the test runs or the initial probes for the massive cyber offensive that accompanied the airstrikes.
Those probes are a classic indicator. You have to test the defenses before you commit the main force. The fact that those probes were happening during the height of the peace negotiations is the ultimate proof of insincerity. You don't hack into your negotiating partner's power grid while you are trying to sign a peace treaty with them. It just doesn't happen.
Unless the treaty is the distraction. It makes me think about the future of the region. If this is the new standard, where diplomacy is just a branch of the military's deception plan, how do we ever get back to a world where a handshake actually means something? Or is that just a naive relic of a previous era?
I think we are in a period of deep strategic distrust that will last for a generation. The success of the facade in 2026 has essentially poisoned the well for future negotiations. Every diplomatic overture will now be viewed through the lens of Operation Epic Fury. The adversary will be looking for the hidden missiles behind every peace proposal. It might lead to a more honest form of geopolitics, where nobody even pretends to talk anymore, but that also makes the world a much more dangerous place because there are no off-ramps left.
It is the ultimate irony. By using diplomacy to make the war more efficient, we have made it harder to ever find peace again. Daniel's prompt really hits on the core of this transition. We move from a world where war was the failure of diplomacy to a world where diplomacy is a weapon of war.
It is a technical evolution of the battlefield. Information is a domain just like land, sea, or air. And in the information domain, diplomacy is just another tool for deception and maneuver. If you can convince your enemy to stay in their barracks for one extra day because they think a deal is coming, that is worth more than an entire division of tanks. The Israeli internal pressure only made this more acute. They didn't have the luxury of a long war, so they used the diplomacy to ensure the short war was as devastating as possible.
I keep thinking about the civilian evacuations you mentioned earlier. That feels like such a clear human indicator. You can hide a tank in a hangar, but it is hard to hide the fact that the families of all the diplomats are suddenly flying back to Washington or Jerusalem. If you see the school buses for the embassy kids being parked and the families heading to the airport, that is your 30-minute warning.
It really is. And it wasn't just the US and Israel. We saw similar patterns with other regional allies who were in the loop. The movement of high-value assets out of the line of fire is a universal indicator. If we look back at the build-up patterns from episode 831, we can see the foundation being laid. But by February 2026, it wasn't just a build-up anymore, it was a countdown.
Let's try to provide an actionable framework for our listeners. If they're looking at a future crisis, how did they distinguish between diplomatic noise and diplomatic signal?
I would break it down into 3 pillars. Pillar 1 is the logistics tail. Ignore what the Secretary of State says and look at the movement of fuel, medical supplies, and ammunition. These are the most expensive and difficult things to move. If they are moving toward the theater, the war is already decided. Pillar 2 is the civilian footprint. Watch the families of diplomats and the non-essential staff. If they leave, the clock is ticking. Pillar 3 is the financial undercurrent. Watch the insurance premiums for shipping and the movement of sovereign wealth funds. Money is the most honest indicator we have.
That is a solid framework. It is about looking for the material reality that the rhetoric can't hide. I also think we need to watch the cyber probes Herman mentioned. If you see infrastructure glitches in a potential adversary's country during a peace talk, that is a huge red flag.
And keep an eye on the back channels. If they stay silent, that might actually be a better sign than if they suddenly get noisy again. After the Muscat facade, a quiet period might mean that both sides are actually reassessing their positions rather than just trying to trick each other into another ambush.
It is a hall of mirrors, but that is why we do this, to try and find the one mirror that isn't distorted. Daniel's prompt was a great way to peel back the layers on this. It is easy to get caught up in the headlines, but the real story is always in the stuff that doesn't make the front page.
The real story is in the logistics tail, the fuel reserves, and the insurance premiums. If you follow the material reality, the rhetoric can't lead you astray. It was a masterclass in strategic deception, and we are going to be studying the lead up to March 2026 for a very long time.
The lingering question for me is whether a return to genuine diplomacy is even possible now, or has the facade become the new standard? We have entered the epic fury era, where the cost of the deception might be a permanent trust deficit that makes every future conflict more likely to turn kinetic because no one believes in the off-ramps anymore.
It is a somber thought. We have optimized war at the expense of peace. The technical efficiency of the March strikes was incredible, but the geopolitical cost is a world where a handshake is just a way to keep your opponent's hand busy while you reach for your holster.
Well, I think we have thoroughly deconstructed the facade for today. It is a lot to chew on, especially the idea that the very thing meant to prevent war was used to facilitate it. But that is the world we are living in now.
It is a world where being technically literate and paying attention to the boring details is the only way to stay informed. The flashy stuff is just there to distract you.
For anyone who wants to go deeper into the early stages of this build-up, I definitely recommend checking out episode 831. It provides the baseline for everything we talked about today and shows just how long this has been in the works. It wasn't a sudden escalation, it was a multi-month logistical progression that we were tracking even back then.
And if you want to see the immediate context just days before the escalation, episode 8081 offers the sidetrip from February 27th. It is a perfect snapshot of that moment when the diplomatic noise was at its peak and the military indicators were screaming.
And finally, episode 925 covers the launch of Epic Fury and Roaring Lion in detail, showing the kinetic result of the facade we have been analyzing. It is a good companion to this discussion to see how the logistics we discussed translated into actual operations.
It is a complex story with a lot of moving parts, and we are still learning new things every day as more information comes to light. That is the nature of the beast. We are analyzing history while it is still happening.
It keeps things interesting, if nothing else. I think we can wrap it up there. This has been an intense dive into a pretty heavy topic, but a necessary one given where we are in the world right now.
I agree. It is important to look at these events with a cold, analytical eye, regardless of how we feel about the outcomes. The mechanics of the deception are what we need to understand if we want to be prepared for what comes next.
Well said. We will be back soon with another prompt, hopefully something a little lighter, but you never know what Daniel is going to send our way.
That is the beauty of the show. We never know what is coming until it hits our inbox.
Keeps us on our toes. Thanks as always to our producer, Hilbert Flumingtop, for keeping the gears turning behind the scenes and making sure we don't wander too far off into the weeds.
And a big thanks to Modal for providing the GPU credits that power this show and allow us to do these deep dives every week. We couldn't do it without their support.
This has been My Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show and finding these breakdowns useful, a quick review on your favorite podcast app really helps us reach more people who are looking for this kind of deep dive analysis.
It makes a huge difference for a show like ours. We appreciate everyone who takes the time to do that.
Until next time, I am Corn.
And I am Herman Poppleberry.
Stay curious and keep an eye on those logistics.
See you next time.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, My Weird Prompts, where